Project Lawful aka Planecrash by Arwayne aka Eliezer Yudkowsky and Lintamande. To Hell with Science, Episode 127.
Breaking out of your language and finding new structures in which it is possible to frame the correct hypothesis is legendarily the most difficult part of science to teach. Any part of it that's been reduced to a formula is no longer the difficult part of the problem. In the case of things like manufacturing acid and improving spellsilver refinement, you'll be at a great advantage because I can tell you much of the correct language to think about those problems. Until we start trying to improve those processes using Dathilani knowledge plus magic, as was never in Dathilan, and then we're back to pre-paradigmatic experimentation again. Since jumping out of the system is such a vital part of the science problem, and so difficult to reduce to formula, there is law of it, but it doesn't help much unless you're making some really basic mistakes. It is mainly taught to Dathilani children by experience. For example, Dathilani children are told that the reward of passing a competence test will be theirs, if they can only guess correctly what it is that holds up the sun in the sky and prevents it from falling down and guides its motion as it circles our planet every day. Is there some shell that holds it in place? Invisible wires? Is the sun just made of very light material so that it doesn't fall? Of this, it is forbidden to speak to children until they guess it for themselves. Only then, as their reward, are they shown where they are within the universe, where they have always lived all their time. I assume everybody here was already spoiled on that one because Galarian. But just in case, raise your hand if you already know.
Chelish wizard students do in fact know that the sun is very far away, and Galarian circles it.
In retrospect, I should have checked that before showing the current researchers where Dathilan was within its universe. But looks like no harm done. So yes, until the kid says that they suspect that Dathilan is spinning in place, and that just makes it look like the sun is circling it, while the sun is staying in place, they're not shown any model of Dathilan's solar system. And then, once they see it, there's a new question. What motive force keeps Dathilan circling the sun? What keeps the other planets circling the sun? What keeps the moon circling Dathilan? Why don't they wobble out of place, slow to a halt, or keep going in a straight line instead? Everyone know that one already? Raise your hand if you do.
They are taught, too, that it's gravity, the force that pulls the heavenly bodies in their places. They are not specifically taught why gravity causes that to happen instead of causing some other thing.
Well, that seems like an important Dath Elon fact. The not telling anyone about the solar system before they've earned it. How many kids ever figure that out? Approximately intelligence 16 on average, so what, 40, 50%? She's still got to be crap at probabilities for things where you don't have any examples to work from, and she's not sure that the fact that Galarian is spinning even was something that humans ever figured out on their own. So, it's hard to say how long they could go without figuring it out, but she doesn't feel like she could possibly have more than a 50% chance of figuring that out alone. Probably way less than that. Maybe if someone were standing by to tell her right away which of her guesses were wrong, like in the exercise just now, so that she could take hundreds and hundreds of wild guesses until she happened upon the right one by being ever more imaginative. But a lot of people still wouldn't, right? There could be lots of stuff like that that people aren't privy to until they've figured out some crucial element for themselves. That fits into what the Chosen of Asmodeus was saying earlier about how lies are necessary for most people, but how it's possible for some people to actually be told the truth without the truth making them even more wrong. Maybe you first have to demonstrate that you're the sort of person who can figure out some pieces of the truth on your own before you can be trusted with more adjacent pieces. And she might feel just a tiny bit of pride about that. Not so much for herself, but for the 5-year-old who had the impulse to chase the shadows of true things through the pages of library books that were incompetently censored. She wouldn't have to feel so concerned about having that impulse if the way of knowing true things without breaking was to earn them. Except wait, if you prove it in a context where you can guess as many times as you want, You haven't proved that you'll consistently land on the right answer with the right information at all. You've only proven something about the scope of your imagination, which might be useful for finding right answers, but also seems like it would lead to lots of wrong ones.
You know, I'm confused about why anyone would spoil the puzzle for you by telling you that it had something to do with gravity, and then not teach you any of the math you would need to do anything with that knowledge, or really actually know it at all. Namely, calculus. I'll have to think if there's anything I want to do with that. Possibly you weren't spoiled on at least some parts of that puzzle. We've now seen what's implicitly the hardest part of the problem that's most difficult to train. Picking the right language to think in. Dathilani kids get exposed to lots of problems that require jumping out of the system, finding a solution that violates what you thought were the rules, problems that are unsolvable until you look at them from the right angle of sideways, etc., etc. I'll see what I can do about recollecting some of those and throwing them at you. The warning sign that you need to jump out of the system is the feeling that you've just had. Well, that everyone except Carissa had. Frustration, flailing around in the dark, trying desperate wild ideas and getting unhelpful results one after another. When you feel like that, you're probably thinking in the wrong language, or missing something fundamental, or trying to do something that is in fact impossible, or impossible using the tools you have. In the absence of that warning sign, if it's plausible you're thinking in the right language at all, the next step is trying ideas from that language, looking for experiments that give interesting results, not just experiments that prove a particular theory, and then interpreting what you see. But first, I conjecture that, although you all continue to look very interested and cheerful, even having finished the task requiring you to control your expressions, you are in fact stressed out by how I was asking you to do something you were never taught how to do. All pre-paradigmatic science is like that. Let's be clear. Pre-paradigmatic science is what you do when you don't know what to do next. Like the distinction between calculation, when you know the next steps, and mathematical thinking, when you need to figure out the next steps. You are here to invent the straightforward solutions that other people will someday learn, and that is not, itself, a straightforward task. But while you are learning to do that, if you ever want, for example, any recovery breaks after I've asked you to do something that was in fact very stressful, you need to actually show any emotion. Or, failing that, say something out loud about it. When I first met the current researchers, I was trying out Dathilani teaching methods that aim to produce confusion, so that people can learn what to do when they are confused. Instead of looking confused, my students continued to look fixedly cheerful and enthusiastic, as is a Chelish person's dignity. So I tried harder to confuse them. Bit of a communication with aliens problem there. Iona, am I wrong about this? I was expecting you tell me they were feeling stressed about...
They're a bit stressed, but they also think of themselves as tough Asmodeans who wouldn't be happy about my speaking up about it. And they are, in fact, tough Asmodeans who'll end up fine, even if you stress them out for a few hours more. We were scheduled to go to the World Wound. Some of the people here are back from it.
Cool, I can respect that. Regardless of how tough you are or how much I respect that, take a 5-minute break anyways, to recover from that and talk among yourselves. The Tier 1 researchers will clear out in the meanwhile, so you're not around anybody too high above you in the org chart. Ione, Carissa, Maritzel, Asmodia with me.
Alexandra has been carefully modulating his emotional reactions and letting 5 to 10% of them through. He's kind of surprised that Keltham hasn't noticed how obviously he's giving off signs. He stops once Keltham leaves, of course. It's easier for him to think if he doesn't need to bother controlling his emotions and can just conceal them and focus on what matters. How could he have solved the puzzle better? How could he have not come in last? Other than sabotaging the other researchers, which would get him punished and alter Alexandra would never do, and so he is at no point seriously considering. He can name the unspoken assumption he made now, that math never reacted to you, but the math was supposed to be a simulation of nature, which can react to you. As in Keltham, experimenting with acid and needing protection spells. If he had paid more attention to the instructions, he might have noticed the confusion. That he didn't was an error characteristic of underestimating Keltham, an error he had been warned against and made anyway. He is still kind of expecting to be whipped for that. He can understand smart mistakes not getting you whipped, but stupid ones? Either way. So the warning sign is that he can't think of anything to try. In practice, he could think of things to try: prime numbers, size caps, base 12, individual orders of magnitude, but all of them were unlikely. They were inelegant. They depended on Keltham having arbitrarily designated some range of numbers as acceptable, instead of having a very simple rule that was just outside what he could imagine. The key thing to search for is the mental state. His frustration. The sense that he was beating his head against a wall. Well, he can look for that. Also, more worrisome, every Dath Ilani child can solve the mystery of the planet's motion. More evidence that he's in over his head, as if he doesn't have enough. He is starting to understand his superior's frustration and to be impressed at their accomplishments. He will need to work harder.
The kid really does think infuriatingly highly of himself. Not that he's wrong to. It is clear why he is worth as much as he is to Cheliax, and probably any random peasant who suddenly found himself treasured by the crown and fought over by gods themselves would comport themselves similarly. She worries, though, that it's contagious. Part of what Keltham is trying to impart is the habits of Dath Ilan, the attitudes of Dath Ilan, and Keltham is a teenager who thinks too highly of himself. And so he'll teach them all to become teenagers who think too highly of themselves. You should never get too attached to a single frame through which to view a person, but as a first pass it seems to explain Keltham and Asmodia both. The chosen of Asmodeus, she does not dare assess in the same terms, not exactly. The classroom is frightfully silent, probably because everyone is waiting for her to say something. Well, she'll let them wait a bit longer. She's not here to make them feel like there's someone competent around, even though obviously she is having that effect.
At Ostenso, Pilar was often the first person to talk during a silence. A little annoying, maybe, but she understood why it had to be her. If Keltham asked later, Willa, Alexandra, and Tonya got cookies from me. I get why nobody in real Cheliax wants one right now, but those reasons don't apply in Alter Cheliax.
Corva doesn't say anything to anyone because she doesn't have anything to say. She doesn't think about the problem either or how she could have solved it faster. She hasn't made it through all of the transcripts that were given to her yet. But she's definitely noticed the pattern that Keltham will constantly say things that appear to be hopelessly convoluted and complex before more information reveals that he's actually saying something very simple, and that she wouldn't have gotten if she had been busy trying to figure out what it could possibly be with only the information she had so far. So she'll wait and see if there are any later clues that indicate that she hasn't fully understood the lesson that's been taught to her. Corva privately supposes that there are actually lots of different reasons why someone might not want a cookie.
Also, most of the reasons the atmosphere in Alter Cheliax would be less funereal ought to apply here, and you could all stand to relax, Gregoria says. That went fine. There'll be homework, and how you do on it will matter much more for Keltham's impression of your intelligence than this. So you're not Sever. You already knew that.
Is she always much more skilled in everything? Sibylla asks.
If so, she doesn't always show it. Asmodia usually finishes the purer math stuff ahead of her. You're definitely allowed to be faster if you can. In Alter Cheliax, there's no chosen of Asmodeus.
Is Keltham under the impression she has the same standing as his other students? He indicated she was responsible for the name tags, if they didn't happen. Has he not noticed that Will obviously make the name tags happen?
You know, I don't know, says Gregoria. I think he says this is Carissa's problem if no one else solves it because he doesn't think highly of the project staff and he trusts her, but possibly the project logistics staff in fact work a lot harder when he says that. Because they don't get as many lectures as we do about acting like they're in Alter Cheliax.
If they have not been instructed better, they are definitely doing the idiotic thing.
Is she not officially his deputy? Alexandra asks, having memorized the org chart last night so he could know he officially had to defer to. And the leading shareholder, not from Dath Ilan?
Correct. She read the corporate contracts a few times because Alter Peranza likes civilization things.
That fails to solve your problem, which is that anything Keltham deputizes will get done as quickly as if his deputy were really in charge of this whole operation. In Alter Cheliax, I cannot imagine logistics would be tripping over themselves to help Alter Sevar.
Alter Sevar is still sleeping with the Queen.
Can everyone extrapolate my response, or need I say it, possibly in more filtered company?
Gregoria has honestly half lost track of what they're arguing about.
Willa is unhappy that Alter Willa needed a cookie. Outside of that, 5 minutes isn't a lot of time for Keltham to get safely far away and back, so she's going to stay firmly in her shell, just in case. Even if it is, she isn't really feeling gregarious at the moment. She'll let the conversation about Sever mostly flow over her. What she wants to do is use Mage Hand to play with her quill. It's one of her favorite ways to de-stress, and won't it be pretty to watch once she gets that arcane sight? But doing that would probably draw attention that she doesn't want to deal with. It might not even be adequately shy. She'll have to stew without assistance instead. Willa wants to be special, and she's made negative progress at that since getting on this project. She isn't especially good at the work, yet. She couldn't make clever statements even if she could think of any, and most of her superiors already dislike her. She feels frustrated, like she doesn't have the right tools to solve the problem. Alter Keltham, who she could whine to about this problem, would tell her to step outside of the solution space. What's special about Willa? If she gets hired, she's going to be selling her soul. That isn't special, especially not in Cheliax. But also selling an option on her sold soul is. Is it useful somehow? She can't think of how, especially since all the other new hires will be in the same boat. But it's a persistent idea all the same. Selling an option on a soul feels like it was definitely someone stepping outside of a solution space. But as far as she can tell, it's not to her benefit. Hell is going to own her soul. In all respects, it should probably act as normal until and unless the option is executed. What other especially unusual stuff has happened? People keep ominously mentioning the tropes, so they're probably something special. But without knowing anything else about what they aren't special in any useful way. Even the 246 math looking back at you angle doesn't help if you have no idea what you're trying to look at.
Alexandra thinks about telling Lady Eulalia Avaricia de Seguer that, actually, no, in an Alter Cheliax that was at all competent, logistics would be tripping over each other to help Keltham's deputy, because literally every instant of Keltham's time is worth more than the lives of several dozen ordinary people. It's an enjoyable fantasy which would be highly unwise for his future life expectancy to try to execute, so he isn't going to do it. He's just going to think about it.
And everyone's quiet again. She'll give it one more try. Corva, you finished faster than anyone who wasn't Tier 1. Any advice that carries over to the rest of us? This isn't a normal competition. The whole project succeeds or fails as one, and you end up a duchess if it succeeds.
Corva has literally zero desire to be a duchess, which does not at all mean that she doesn't separately want the project to succeed. Also, she kind of hates talking to people, but that doesn't mean she can't answer direct questions. Honestly, I think I got lucky. But I thought afterwards that I would have gotten it faster if I'd been a small child, because I wouldn't have taken as many math classes, and wouldn't have learned the implicit rule that math classes almost always deal with problems where the same input always gets the same output. And since a lot of the people in this room were specifically picked for their ability in math classes, they might be even more vulnerable to that than a normal person. So I was thinking that the next time I ran into a problem like this, if I got stuck, it might be worth pretending to be 5 and seeing if it helps anything.
The problem with saying things is that most things make you look weak, foolish, or low status. So, useful information, Corva. We're all better off for you providing it. Alexandra is keeping his mouth shut.
Willa's model of her 5-year-old self has a lot of really obviously terrible ideas about how to try to be special here.
And Keltham is back. He doesn't ask what transpired during his absence, so nobody has to scramble to make anything up. He does ask if anyone's got any brief questions before the next lecture section.
Message on relay from Asmodia to Lady Avaricia. Security forwarded your observation to us. Mostly, Sevar and Maya Yal and Security and myself are already on task for deciding which Keltham requests get handled at what speed. Name tags will arrive shortly before the hour is up. But your point is a valid one, and I'll ensure that staff here understand what Sevar's Alter Cheliak's priority should look like absent other instructions, namely less than Keltham's and higher than any other project members.
Lady Avarisha's immediate thought in response is that this is satisfactory behavior from Asmodia, though she does not expect that to be relayed to Asmodia in light of how Asmodia is technically her superior here. She has no brief questions for Keltham.
No questions, huh? All right then, onwards. When Keltham was inquiring into spell-silver refinement, he was told that among the things they'd tried were Orkwar, using the ash of bones from different animals, and some varieties of people, in case those had more potent alchemical properties than the ash of ordinary random bones. Prayer. Using fire instead of acid. Having a step in the process performed by god-related people, possibly clerics, but why didn't they just say that? Well, anyways. Alas and alack a day, none of this worked to improve spell silver refinement. The students here may now recognize this as a variant of their own frantic flailing on the 2-4-6 game. To be clear, it's much more respectable and dignified to frantically flail around with random experiments in your current broken specification language of experiments than to not try anything. They would have been ill-served in the 2-4-6 game by pulling back after their 10th failed attempt to do nothing but think. The Keltham environment was still walking around, and there's no point in not running tests when the environment is right there and cheap to query. Still, if you imagine yes as meaning yes, that didn't improve spell silver refinement. Everything the refiners tried got the same old frustrating yes. When you haven't yet found the answer outside your previous language, the brilliant hypothesis to test, what can you possibly do besides frantic flailing at a process that just keeps on returning the same answer? Some of the candidates here did figure out something to do, besides just frantic flailing, as they zoomed in, or it looked to Keltham like they were following that track anyways.
Not sure if Keltham explained this yet, but his rule is that students recognized as more advanced speak later, so none of the current researchers will try answering that until some of the new candidates have spoken. Keltham will also be more impressed by wrong answers than no answers, especially if the silence has gone on for more than a few moments.
Affirmed. Thanks, Ione.
Check whether you're asking the right question, says Corva, because she needs to speak up for the first time at some point. So for the spell silver question, take a step back and double-check whether there are any other ways of obtaining more spell silver besides improving the existing refinement process.
Not the answer I had in mind, but a fair one. I did in fact check whether it was possible to detect giant masses of pure spell silver from a very long distance away, in which case I'd have some ideas about where to look for those elsewhere inside a stellar system, but no such detection method was known. Alexandra said after reading the name tag, of course. By the time you were finishing up, it looked to me like you were no longer just looking at my yes answers. You were thinking about something else too. Am I correct?
He does not think Keltham means his flailing with prime numbers or powers or base 12, which means Keltham already knows. You are, says Alexandra. I was paying attention to your response time. You responded faster to some queries, slower to others. Since all questions received the answer yes, I gained almost no information from a yes. So instead, I focused my investigation on what triggered an unusual response from you, in the hopes that would lead me to the law.
Well stated. The reason being, of course, that as there were more and more inputs on your paper, I had to scan through more and more of them to check you weren't repeating anything, especially if the input was just a few small digits with a particular pattern of positive and negative values. I could, of course, lengthen all of my response times equally to eliminate the information from this timing side-channel attack. I elected not to, because it was illustrating an important point. From the standpoint of the law of probability, any time you see evidence that's almost entirely what you expect, it's not producing much of a shift between hypotheses. You were already expecting the yes answers, so that part wasn't informative. You might not have had the correct hypothesis about what was producing the timing differences to see that it was being validated, but at least you weren't already sure of what the timing would be like on each input. By poking around there, you were gaining information faster than you could gain it from apparently, just always answering yes to everything. Willa, you're one of the others who noticed the timing side channel, or so it looked to me. How would you apply a similar kind of reasoning to spell silver mining?
Wow, this is terrifying. She obviously has to think fast here. I would shy away from trying new tests, similar to tests that got a result that was just as good, or almost as good, as the usual process. I'd focus on ideas where the first test went really badly and screwed everything up somehow, and try to do something slightly different than that. Because if it managed to make a lot of difference, even if it was bad, doing something similar might make a lot of difference. That's good. You'd need to be pretty wealthy to do tests like that because you'd waste a lot of ingredients and potential spell silver that way, though, and maybe never get anything to show for it.
Somewhat valid? It's usually not true that if you can make something a lot worse, you can reverse the same manipulation to make it a lot better. Especially if you're dealing with processes that somebody already refined to near an optimum. Lots of things that aren't at all like the current refining process won't work at all to refine spell silver. If you find that result, it's not surprising. The version of your idea that I'd suggest is to look for things you can do that make spell silver refinement slightly worse, rather than wrecking it completely. Then, measuring quantitatively how much more of those things you can do, to make the output how much worse. Then, trying to see if you could predict those quantities, maybe not in the sense that you would have a brilliant theory about it, but in the sense of trying some new intervention that ought to make things slightly worse, and trying to call in advance how exactly that would go. Similarly, if you've been mounting a more serious attack on the Keltham environment, your obvious next step, from a Dath Ilani standpoint, would be measuring my response times down to the second, or even a fraction of a second, writing those down, and trying to predict them precisely. This already is a way of thinking that seems not quite to be known yet in Galarian. The spell silver miners and refiners to whom I spoke had stories of what didn't work, but not measurements of exactly how much it made things worse, nor theories to predict exactly how much damage would be done by which failed interventions.
Willa feels chastened. She was so eager to step outside the solution space that she went too far outside it, and looked stupid again. But it occurs to her now that even if you were trying relatively risky experiments, you might not have to actually try them all. You could just decide on what experiments you might do and then use auguries or even more powerful future-predicting divinations to see if they would lead anywhere or not. It'd be a little bit error-prone, but it'd also be much cheaper and faster than going without. This isn't to say you wouldn't still do experiments and take data, but the experiments you ended up doing would be selected in advance by a sort of filter. You'd effectively be putting more educational sequences into your 246 game, on average. This is an idea born of magical knowledge, though, and so it might be more than a little dangerous, especially because getting Keltham into the habit of preparing and using too many divinations of that sort could end up going pretty badly. But then again, it's the kind of thing Keltham will probably think of doing himself before too long, and it might make the conspiracy universe more probable if all these other people more used to having magic available didn't suggest it first. She thinks loudly at security to ask Asmodia if she thinks mentioning this augury pre-experimenting line of thought is worth the risk.
Sevar's call. Considerations. Asmodia can see include, if he relies more on auguries, we can spoof him. It adds a random factor that makes it difficult to control him. We screw up the probabilities on augury failures. If this speeds things up, we want his work sped up. If this is a good technique, we want it developed here and not in Osirian later.
She'd be firmly against, if not for the ability to spoof the augury. Given that, it seems worth proposing.
Willa manages to be surprised that she gets to ask the question herself. She'd kind of been assuming her questions would go to someone else if they somehow managed to be good. In hindsight, that would probably create bad colors on the wall, which is something she should have thought of to begin with. What if we used auguries to help select our experiments? We would think of 2 plausible experiments to do every time we would have done one, and then cast augury to pick which. She's getting pretty excited now, and her words start speeding up. It wouldn't always select the more useful one, but it would more often than not. so the data we'd get would probably end up being more useful. We could make progress faster, and we could even try slightly riskier, costlier experiments, since the worst failures would usually be filtered out by the auguries.
Auguries are second circle spells, and trade off directly against resist energy, acid spells. Their time horizon is roughly half an hour, and they're not reliable enough that we could try anything. We had a strong prior expectation would be dangerous, even if otherwise cleared by augury. It's not a bad idea, but relatively narrowly applicable. We apply it only when the experiment is expensive enough that we don't just do it regardless, only when the time horizon is less than half an hour, only when the danger level is such that the augury's likelihood ratio of around 4 actually shifts our decision. We'd also have to experiment earlier to see if augury could learn to define got a surprising or enlightening result, rather than improved the manufacturing process as being the good outcome. Which is my way of changing the subject back to the next point I was going to make. Civilization teaches a soft, conceptual separation between understanding a phenomenon and improving it. We want to develop magical science, and it's tempting to jump right to casting auguries as a way of improving it. But first, we'd want to understand how auguries interact with the work of science. Can augury define got a surprising or enlightening result, rather than improve the manufacturing process as being the good outcome, if that's what we want? Is an augury smart enough to know that a very surprising explosion can be worth the cost of equipment destroyed for what the explosion tells us? Do we have to figure that out within half an hour for the augury to know it was worth it? The first step would be to do promising experiments, cast auguries before doing them, go on to do the experiment regardless of what the augury said, and figure out exactly what auguries were telling us. The question that science begins from is, how do we understand spell silver refining? And it is then this understanding that we use to ask, how do we improve spell silver refining? The heartbeat of cognition, as it would be said out of Dath Ilan, is that sensory information floods into you on the diastolic beat. From this, you build a map or model of reality. Then you search for strategies that the current model predicts may succeed. Then actions surge out of you on the systolic beat, which actions affect the environment and the sense data you get on the next heartbeat. Where, of course, it's not a point-wise perfect analogy, because in your heartbeat, the expansion that draws blood in and the contraction that pushes blood out are distinct phases. In cognition, sensory information is always coming in, and we're always acting. But you get the idea. Well, hopefully you get the idea. I'll actually just spell out the idea. The idea is that we can be overeager about jumping ahead to trying to improve things, not so much before we understand them, but without having properly realized that understanding is a distinct task that we can focus on and solve in its own right. Consider again the spell silver refiners. If they'd been saying to themselves, how can I figure out exactly what's happening during the spell silver refining process? They might have performed different experiments and taken more precise notes. Contrasted to asking, does this work to improve refining? And then when the answer is no, they treat that as a failure. The same distinction reproduces itself on the meta level. You should consider yourself as first asking, not how can I make science work better, but rather, what are the rules governing which ways of pursuing science would yield which sorts of things happening? If you're just running ahead trying to improve things, you might think that map first, then improve sounded like great advice. Once you enter the mapping mindset, you'll realize that the key claim is more like people who follow map first, then improve, ultimately invent improvements faster than people who don't follow that advice. That makes it plainer that this advice is really a theory, and a theory you could poke at and test to understand the laws governing people using science. Then, with this understanding, try to improve your pursuit of science. This process of science reflecting and improving on itself is not, to be clear, something you can continue without limit until it turns you into a god. There's diminishing returns, and the process asymptotes, at least as humans do it in Dath Ilan. Once you're doing most basic things right, doing things slightly more perfectly, then that is often not worth the extra time it takes to think. But that process of reflection is how you get to the point of doing the basics correctly. And that's not a process Galarian has undergone yet.
Well, The sort of tedious people who make spell silver for a living haven't undergone it yet. Lady Avariccia thinks she'd do fine at it if she were going to work for a living.
What's a diastolic beat?
Your heartbeat has two distinct components. A diastolic beat, where your heart opens valves to your veins that carry blood inwards towards the heart and expands to draw in blood. Then a systolic beat, where your heart closes those valves and opens valves to the arteries that carry blood outward and contracts to force the blood it drew in outwards. Or in more detail, it's really more of a four-stage process where blood gets pulled inward from your body, pumped outward to your lungs to get element 8 restored from the air you breathed in and exchanger 28S16, to your lungs for you to exhale, pulled back into your heart, and pumped out to the rest of the body, except that the two pulling in stages from body and lungs and the two pumping out stages to body and lungs happen simultaneously, even as blood flows through 4 different pipelines. I can draw a diagram if for some reason it's important. I think I'd actually rather return to the thing it was a metaphor for. Sensory information coming into our brain hearts from the environment body. Us thinking, which you could see as a kind of lungish metaphor thing, actions going out of the brain heart to the environment body, interacting with the environment, and we then see what happened when the sensory information comes back in. Only as a continuous process rather than in distinct stages. Actually, forget that entire metaphor. Just remember that improving things and understanding things are distinct tasks, and you can often make more headway by separating out the understanding part so you can explicitly pursue it as a task in itself.
Does the distinction between understanding and improving correspond to the distinction between the law of probability and the law of utility? It sounds like it should.
Sensible question, but no, not exactly. Probability is something like a separable core that lies at the heart of probable utility. The process of updating our beliefs, once we have the evidence, is something that in principle doesn't depend at all on what we want. The way reality is something defined independently of anything we want. The scaffolding we construct between propositions and reality, or probabilities and reality, doesn't have a term inside it for how much would you value that thing, just is the coin showing queen or text. But the process of science, of experimenting on something to understand it, doesn't belong purely to probability. You have to plan experiments to find ones that distinguish between the possible hypotheses under consideration, or even just, are effective at probing to uncover surprises and unexpected patterns that give you a first handle on what's happening. The law of probability just says how to update after you get the evidence. Planning an experiment that you then act on, implement, is the domain of probable utility and can't exist apart from it. In fact, the influence of the utility function on epistemics, the influence of what we ultimately want on how we map reality, is in theory, but not in practice, much more pervasive. In principle, how we classify things in reality and lump them together, treating all gold pieces as gold pieces instead of as uniquely detailed individual elements of reality, reflects how any two gold pieces are usually equally useful to us in carrying out the same kinds of plans. They are plan interchangeable. In practice, even people who want pretty different things, on a human scale, will often find pretty similar categories useful, once they've zoomed into similar levels of overall detail. Alani kids get told to not get fascinated with the fact that, in principle, bounded agents with finite memories and finite thinking speeds have any considerations about mapping that depend on what they want. It doesn't mean that you get to draw in whatever you like on your map, because it's what you want. It doesn't make reality be what you want. But when it comes to science, it really does matter in practice that planning an experiment is about wanting to figure something out and doing something you predict will probably yield some possibly useful information. And this is an idea you just can't express at all without some notion of probable utility. You're not just passively updating off information somebody else gave you. You're trying to steer reality through time to make it give up information that you want. Even when you do get information passively, figuring out what to think about it reflects which thoughts you expect will be useful. So the separable core of probability inside of probable utility is really more of a law thing about basic definitions than anything that corresponds to there being a sort of separable person who only implements a shadow of probability and doesn't shadow any structure cast from probable utility, who's really great at understanding things and unraveling mysteries and answering questions, but never plans anything or tries to improve anything. Because humans are constantly, ubiquitously in the unseen, background choosing which thought to think next in order to figure things out, usually wordlessly, but in words too when the problems get especially difficult. Just the action of turning your head in a direction to look at something because you wordlessly anticipate gaining info that has the consequence of helping you answer some other question is, in theoretical terms, an action.
Just to check, is that supposed to be some kind of incredibly deep lesson full of meaning about something else important? If so, I didn't get it.
Nah, it's just an answer to your question. Or at least, if it had some hugely important hidden meaning about how to avoid some dreadful science-related catastrophe. I didn't get it either, when it was emphasized to me as a kid.
If you wish to support this AI reading and others like it, please visit patreon.com/AskWhoCastsAI. Any help is appreciated. And thank you to executive producer John Doe 7776059.